Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. I think people might be shocked to learn that the largest arms trade show in North America takes place every year in Ottawa. They call it CanSec, and it hosts the very people that are heavily profiteering off of not just the genocide in Gaza, but the entire culture of war. We're talking security firms, tech companies, and of course, weapons manufacturers. Millions of dollars are spent trying to impress the exact targets of peace activists right now and to elevate Canada's image in the global arms trade. World Beyond War activists and other peace activists have been protesting outside of CanSec for years. But this year, they shut that shit down. Activists formed blockades around the venue, they covered themselves in fake blood, held banners, and they shut down all access to this ghoulish event. In the videos they posted online, you can hear the excitement and sense of achievement in their voices. These folks put their bodies on the line and they won. But it wasn't without cost. One activist was assaulted by some suit trying to get into the trade show. He was arrested by police, as were 7 peace activists. Our next guest is the spokesperson for World Beyond War Canada, who, on top of the action I just told you about, have been doing some amazing work and are on a mission to hold Canada accountable for its role in the genocide in Gaza. Rachel will tell you just how pivotal a role Canada plays in the weapons trade and thus why we have so much work to do here. Welcome to the studio. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So my name is Rachel Small. I work as the Canada organizer for World Beyond War, which is a global grassroots organization and a network that works to abolish war and really the whole military-industrial complex. I'm really a community organizer based in Garundo, Toronto, which is Dish with One Spoon, Treaty 13 Indigenous territory. I've done lots of different types of grassroots organizing over the past few decades, especially in international environmental justice movements. I worked in Latin America for many years, looking at what Canadian mining companies are up to there. So yeah, really all of my work for many years has been focused on acting in solidarity with communities around the world who are affected by, especially like Canadian state or corporate violence. So that has sort of led me into anti-militarism organizing. And of course, my last 6 months have been 100% about Palestine solidarity organizing, as have, millions of people across the country.
I wanted to correct you and say 8 months, but it's just incredibly depressing to keep reminding ourselves how long it's been. Obviously, World Beyond War has a pretty urgent focus at the moment, and we'll get into that. But can we first get an idea of what the organization is, like in terms of size and reach and approach? You guys have been responsible for a lot of the, we'll call them blockades or sit-ins, escalated direct actions that we've seen. So can you take us through that journey a little bit before we start?
So yeah, World Beyond War, I mentioned this a little bit, but we're really a global grassroots network. I mean, I'm the only staff person in so-called Canada, but there are many kind of like volunteers, activists, chapters, members across the country and then around the world, all again advocating for the abolition of war and its replacement with institutions of just and sustainable peace. I might be out of date, but I think at this point we have 35 chapters in 22 countries and members in at least 197 countries around the world. And these chapters operate sort of autonomously where they all are doing whatever makes most sense in the cities, in the countries where they're based, to take on the military-industrial complex. Some of them are in war zones themselves, and other chapters, like for example the chapters across Canada, while of course there is ongoing military and state violence in Canada, they're mostly acting in solidarity with people who are at the front lines of military violence around the world. So yeah, as you kind of hinted at, like here across so-called Canada, we've been just incredibly busy over the past, you're right, I said 6 months before, but it's well over 6 months at this point. I can't believe it. The 8 months of genocide at the hands of the Israeli military, and doing literally everything that we can here to end Canadian government complicity in it, because that really feels like the best way that we can have an impact and do something to end the violence. So World Beyond War has been really focused at specifically looking at the arms trade with Israel, because it felt like a bit of a gap in terms of social movement organizing here. And frankly, the Canadian weapons industry is like this big secret.
Kind of like our mining industry, our dirty secret.
Very similar. It really felt like nobody kind of knew about it. And frankly, like I knew there was a Canadian weapons industry, but it wasn't until I started digging in and mapping it out that I really realized, like, wow, in every, not just province, like in every small city and many small communities across this country, like there is a weapons factory that is making something that is ending up in Israeli weaponry. I had really no idea until I dug in.
I think that would shock people. And I think even now, after I've seen all these actions, I'm still surprised that it's to that extent, because due to resources, folks have largely been focused on some key players in mostly urban settings. But can you give us a bit more of an idea of how widespread that is? Because it would be nice for small town folks to be able to target things. I'm speaking from one, right? A little bit more than an hour out of the city. Sometimes the actions aren't as accessible, but I think folks like to think of ourselves as farmers and like the Canadian image, right? We've talked about that before, and it's just so warped.
Yeah. People are always saying, like, whenever I talk about what Canada's doing, people have this perception of like the tiny nation, right? And whether it's arms or the mining like people have no clue just how big a player Canada is on the international stage. And they like to downplay, what it is that we can actually do. When you're talking about the climate crisis or anything, it's really frustrating because, like, we're getting away with so much shit. Anyway, sorry, I had to get that out.
It's related, though, and it's like that sense of agency that people lose when we frame it that way, as we're just like a small nation, tiny player. But yeah, maybe, Rachel, you could talk about just how big of a player we are and how effective your approach is, because I think maybe I'm assuming something. You're kind of beyond appealing to the politicians. I mean, providing pressure for them is one thing, but like appealing to their goodwill to just stop starting wars, like to be anti-war, that approach just doesn't cut it, right? So you're kind of skipping the middleman of the government, so to speak, and going right at, I mean, you're not ignoring politicians, but...
Yeah, what I have found really exciting about, I mean, this is a moment of like horror and of like deep grief, but an exciting aspect of like the resistance that I'm seeing now, and specifically around all the campaigning that's happening for an arms embargo and like to end the Canada-Israel weapons trade, is that it feels like one of those moments in social movements where we actually are coming at it from all different sides and tactics and approaches, but actually in concert, like in ways that like we actually are moving towards all the same horizon in the same direction, which doesn't always happen. Sometimes it feels like, oh, the direct action folks and the lawyers, like we're contradicting each other. In this case, I would say no, it's been really powerful. So like, for example, there are folks, some like excellent movement lawyers who have literally sued the federal government at the federal court in Canada, highlighting that they're not following their own laws in terms of the arms trade. And like, so that is, an avenue that is being pursued within the court system. And then at the same time, as you highlighted, many folks across the country have been organizing these incredible blockades to like literally shut down work at the weapons factories that are making the components, in many cases, of the F-35s, like the kind of most advanced fighter jet that Lockheed's fighter jet that the Israeli military is using, at the same time as people are doing like sit-ins and protests outside of like every MP office to make it clear, like, actually this is your decision and like actually you are responsible for what's happening over there. At the same time that like there are marches 1,000 strong crisscrossing at least this city in Toronto every single week, like, and it actually to me is feeling like we are all pushing in the same direction. So we're not just doing the rail blockades and the weapons factory work stoppages and that kind of stuff, and we're not just in the courts and we're not just on the streets, but like really everyone together pushing, yeah, for the same thing.
When you say we, do you mean as a movement or World Beyond War? Like, do you folks, you deploy multiple tactics in that way, or have you focused on a specific avenue of pressure?
Yeah, so I think when I'm saying we, I am referring to sort of the larger Palestinian solidarity movement, and I would never, as World Beyond War, try to take credit for everything. That said, in terms of specifically the campaign for an arms embargo, like to really fully stop the flow of all weapons to and from Israel, World Beyond War is involved at this point in a bunch of the different aspects. So direct action has always been sort of a big part of our work, and frankly, like, is a big part of the legacy of anti-war movements. I mean, obviously the way it looks sometimes has changed, but the legacy of anti-war organizing over the past like 50, 60 years is that, like you said, you don't just wait for the government to do the right thing, you jam up the gears of the war machine yourself, whether that's people blocking the trucks with weapons on it, whether that's the incredible occupations of ports that have happened, or whether that's the student encampments that are amazing right now that we're doing everything we can to support.
Like, from a strictly anti-war movement perspective, not that you're able to take Palestine out of the equation right now, but I mean, pre-October 7th, what were your approaches? The urgency we understand, right? But did you find that there was a shift in the tactics of World Beyond War? And also, maybe if you could tie into that answer, just how the anti-war movement has been in the last, let's say, 9 months, what that arc, because I imagine as you create new networks, like, I see a lot of growth. Not that there wasn't an anti-war movement before this, but it just seems like a completely different animal now. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just more visible, but maybe you could kind of speak to that.
I think that addressing militarism and just like the horrific violence in Gaza specifically has just like become everyone's priority in a way that, yeah, like addressing the Canadian war machine was obviously not before. And frankly, I think that makes sense. Like, there are a lot of crises, and political and environmental and otherwise that we face. And I think it is only natural that like our movements and our efforts are focused in different ways at different moments. So personally, I was not one of those people sort of saying like, oh, why isn't everyone focused on anti-war organizing right now, when what I was seeing was incredible Indigenous solidarity organizing, incredible organizing for climate justice, against police violence. Like, these are all important issues, and frankly are all part of the same struggle. I mean, and for World Beyond War as an abolitionist organization and movement, like, we consider movement to abolish police and prison to be sister movements of ours, and we would never say that those are less important. And I mean, if we're talking about climate justice, like, we know that war and militarism is a primary cause of the climate crisis, and also a primary way that climate justice movements are suppressed. So like these issues are interconnected. But yes, clearly the past several months have been a moment where suddenly people are turning a very close eye to like, oh right, what even does the Canadian military do? Or what is Canada's foreign policy? Like, frankly, it's shocking how little our foreign policy on anything is discussed, how little the average MP knows about Canada's role in the world.
Oh, so they're not just playing dumb, Rachel. Is that what you're telling us? They actually are just oblivious to it all?
That has been my experience.
Okay.
Yeah, that it has, I mean, frankly, that I think people across the country have not made it necessary for their MP to answer questions about foreign politics when they're being elected. I mean, they bear their own responsibility to know about the role of Canada in the world. But frankly, it rarely comes up in pre-election debates. Like, Canada's weirdly insular in that way.
This is true. I've run as a federal candidate, and I don't think foreign policy was ever even considered at any of the debates. I mean, although they were pretty tame in topics. But Yes, yes, we do like to just sweep that under the rug. I think because it's so contradictory to the image that Canada likes to promote, right? So we don't tend to brag about our foreign policy because it's just so bad, and it no longer fits with, not no longer, but they can't even try to sell the peacekeeper image anymore. So I think they've just stopped trying altogether and thinking maybe we won't pay attention, but it's absolutely impossible not to pay attention now. So the arms embargo now, you've talked a little bit about it, but maybe some people are confused because there was a bit of a celebratory moment when the legislature already told us that they would stop supplying arms to Israel. So why the need for this? We understand, as we've walked through it, we've seen, we never trust the government anyway. But, I think Canadians in general might think, but didn't we already get that?
The Canadian government has been deliberately misleading and deeply confusing, very much on purpose, to just mislead people about what the Canada-Israel arms trade looks like. So first they were trying to say things like, oh, we're only exporting non-lethal things, when they were, like, when we know that what Canada exports are like the components of bombing systems, the components of fighter jets. Like, I don't honestly understand.
I guess, like, on its own in a box, it can't kill anyone, Rachel. Like, we can ship it.
It's the targeting system on a missile, but it won't kill you.
We can't help that what they do.
We're selling Lego sets.
Yeah, not on its own. It has to be hooked up to something that someone else, a really bad guy,
To be honest, it
makes.
didn't fool anyone. Like, that tactic did not work for them. So basically, the only thing they have actually done is made a verbal commitment that they are not approving any more new weapons export permits to Israel since the end of 2023. I mean, it's up for debate whether that has in fact borne out, but it may very well have. They may very well have not, since the end of 2023, approved any new weapons permits. The issue is that they approved a record-breaking amount October through December in the first few months of this genocide, and that they haven't canceled all the existing permits.
They're like on hold.
No, the permits that had been approved, those are just going ahead as usual. They are continuing to ship all of those weapons. It's just new theoretical future permits that companies might want to export that they're in theory not approving right now. So it's really upsetting. But frankly, I don't think people are fooled. Like, I think that they were hoping that would placate people, and I'm not seeing that. What I'm seeing is people are increasing their resolve. Earlier in May, we launched the sort of Arms Embargo Now campaign, a big multi-sector demand, as in the initial signatories included unions and environmental organizations and national human rights orgs and faith organizations, like, representing just the initial signatories represented like well over 2 million people across Canada in their membership.
Wow.
And then since then, in just the week following, more than 250 additional organizations have signed on. So this includes like grassroots writing groups fighting for Palestine and some of the largest unions and organizations across the country. So it's really broad, and the demand is really clear. We're demanding a real arms embargo according, ironically, to the Canadian government's own definition of an arms embargo, which is that you don't allow any weapons to go in or out of the country. So not sending them to Israel, which has been extensively covered over the past few months, but also not purchasing them, because Canada is a major purchaser of Israeli weaponry. And that is one of the key ways the Israeli government has said that they plan to fund this extremely expensive military campaign that they're doing, is by expanding their weapons industry. Yeah, and selling it overseas to countries like Canada. So unfortunately, the Canadian government just recently in December approved the purchase of millions of dollars of new Israeli missiles, the same that are being used in Gaza right now, are labeled or advertised as battle tested there. The Canadian government has just approved buying tons of those for the Canadian military. So this is a major way that we're supporting what the Israeli military is doing, not only sending them the weapons, but also buying it from them. But I am encouraged with the launch of this new campaign because of, like I mentioned, really how widespread the sign-on is. They can't say, oh, this is a few fringe, radical, whatever groups. Like, these are some of the largest organizations in the country. And right now we're getting members of parliament to sign on as well. And I'm sure the number will be much higher by the time this airs, but we've already had 20 members of parliament sign on to the demand, including many Liberal MPs. So I think the tide is turning, and there's real power behind this demand right now. But again, none of this would have had any traction without people putting their bodies on the line over the past 8 months over and over again, and making it really clear that, okay, if the government doesn't enforce an arms embargo, we're going to do everything we can ourselves.
I love how the anti-war movement and the potential for embargoes is not just to end war, but knowing Israel plans to fund their Zionist project, it becomes like anti-imperialist. It already was, but an anti-Zionist. And the other thing that's on my mind from what you said, and that is such a political maneuver by the Liberals to phrase it that way for new permits, because all of that may placate the ill-informed. I love that you say like most people didn't fall for it, so massive failure. But I could see how some people were like, okay, they did something. It's something. In the reality, all they're doing is shutting down startups from banking on the genocide, right? Like it just gives preference to the current players who are lobbying them to continue the trade, right? Just tell them you'll stop new ones, right? We'll still be able to do what we're doing. You can still do what you're doing. And maybe a few activists will fall off the way thinking they take a breather. But it hasn't slowed you down at all. So I'm thinking they've got to reinvent the wheel.
But I will say the immediate reaction from Israel, like from the Israeli, I think it was the defense minister, they freaked out. So it was tiny step compared to what we were asking for. But I also want to be clear, it was not nothing. It was huge on the global scale, and it was an example to Canada is considered one of Israel's core allies on the global scale, and so for one of their main allies to do even that, to say for now we're not approving any new weapons permits to you, it was a big deal. And it was something that would never have happened without just the unprecedented resistance across Canada. Without the Liberals feeling like their electability was on the line because of this, it would never have happened. Yes, it is nowhere near enough. Yes, it is political trickery, but I also want to be clear, it was a mini win, and it was, it freaked powerful Israeli decision makers out. And I can't tell you how many calls I've gotten from activists in Spain, in England, in Australia, who want to talk about how did this happen in Canada? What can we learn from you? Because we need our government to start taking these steps. Because in some of these places, they haven't gotten their governments to budge even an inch. So kind of bullshit political maneuvering, but it also is a moment of hope and a moment of us seeing our power. Now we just got to ramp it up.
We've talked about on the show before the right to Palestinian armed resistance. So I want to just kind of ask you how that fits in from an anti-war perspective, because another thing that we've talked about is the call for a ceasefire and some of the issues that go along with that. We've always been clear that stopping the bombs from falling on Gaza is an absolute priority. But the language of using a ceasefire, implies there's two equal parties to a bit. It also perhaps squashes the idea that Palestinians have the right to resist, right, that they should cease resisting. How does that fit with someone who focuses, or an organization that focuses on something from an anti-war perspective?
Yeah, World Beyond War takes, as its kind of stance, does not basically ever come out saying we support basically anyone's being armed in any way and acting in that way, because of sort of the strategic role we play globally, and because frankly, we have chapters in many parts of the world where the context is really different. And for example, for some of our chapters in Africa or in Colombia, it's really important to be a group that is taking a stance against all militarism, all armed groups, to be playing a particular role for peace and justice and resistance. And not a passive role for peace, a very active resistance, but one that doesn't involve arms. That said, we are clearly not spending any of our time or breaths condemning what Palestinians are doing. We are focused on like addressing the military superpowers of the world and like where we're seeing the horrific violence that's happening. So we just are a group that are just like not really gonna speak to that question. It's really not our role. And frankly, for me specifically, as like the Canada organizer with World Beyond War, I'm really focused on what is the Canadian state doing, both in terms of, I mean, things like supporting the Israeli military, but also in terms of like everything the Canadian state is doing here and across Turtle Island, and like what are the ways that, yeah, like military colonization is continuing here. So not to say I'm only going to talk about what Canada is doing overseas, but like it's not my lane to focus on that.
No, I hear you. I just like wondered how you navigated that because it is a little tricky. I get it. At the very beginning of the conversation, you very briefly mentioned alternatives, like replacements to armed resistance, replacements to foreign policies that involve arms and militarism. So as part of like a blueprint for disruption, like how would we disrupt that pattern of war over and over again, right? We end this genocide, but surely, this is replicated over and over again. So can you speak a little bit about those replacements or what that vision looks like beyond what we have? Because we just finished a rant on the ICC and ICJ, and I bet at this time of recording, they're contemplating warrants that I'm sure will help force political pressures. They've largely been ineffective.
I mean, I think that in some ways there's a lot of analogies with the police abolition movement, and people always want kind of this magic bullet, for lack of a better expression, like oh, but if there weren't police, like what about this, what about this, what about that? And there's no like sort of one quick, easy answer if you're unwilling to look at addressing sort of like the bigger picture that puts people in the various situations they're in or that causes people to not have their needs met. We're never talking about replacing just like one incredibly harmful state institution with some other singular thing. Like we have to address the causes like of violence, of poverty, of everything. So World Beyond War has something called the global security system, which is kind of like our broader theory of an alternative to war. And it's roughly divided into like kind of 3 areas. So managing conflict without violence, which includes some strategies like how the United Nations should be reformed. And again, that's not going to solve everything, but there are reforms that would make a difference. How international law institutions, like you mentioned, should be reformed. What are other types of global governance that show promise? What's the role of global civil societies? So like sort of what are other structures that help us manage conflict without violence? Then there's a second facet, which is about demilitarizing security, which gets more into like the actual mechanics of disarmament, or what would creating a peace economy look like, because our current economy is a military economy and is one that is really like built on war at its core. And what would be like ways of phasing out foreign military bases, of dismantling military alliances. And then the third angle is about creating a culture of peace, which I think like can sound kind of like vague or wishy-washy, but again, like there's enormous investment right now in creating a culture of war. It's like deeply embedded in our everything from our like university and educational institutions to like a lot of religious spaces. So like, yeah, what are ways that we actually establish a culture of peace, that we tell a new story, that we like embed that within everything from like elementary school education on up. I know these are like in some cases like big and not always the most satisfying answers, but like getting rid of and taking power away from like the most powerful institutions on earth is going to be a big project.
No. Some of your answers should just generate a whole new discussion, right? Like questions for people to contemplate. Like, we don't expect you to have all the answers, but sometimes just opening up new questions is all you got to do. Not all you have to do, and it's funny that it's not funny that you got there. It's natural that you got there, because I was just going to ask you about trying to reconcile the image of most Canadians being anti-war. And you must know, because you talk to tons of people about the anti-war stand. And I would like to think that most Canadians just like kind of blanket out, would be like, sure, I'm anti-war. War is bad, right? Like there's no celebrating. Well, there is some celebrating war, right? We do a lot of that. But then reconciling that with the fact that most Canadians support sending massive amounts of arms to Ukraine to nations that they feel are justified in using arms for whatever purposes they're up to. You know, how they feel about Israel right now is likely shifted, but prior to this, we were proud of the $9 billion in weapons that we've sent to the Ukraine, but we'd still generally try to call ourselves anti-war. Like, what's happening there in people's psyche? Like, can you've talked to people, help us out.
Yeah, I mean, I do think you're right, though, that, and I mean, there's tons of, like, sort of broad national polling that shows kind of what you said, that, like, when you just ask people, like, a majority of Canadians are, at some base level, like, anti-war, and specifically say that, like, the role they think Canada's military should be playing is one focused on, like, peacekeeping and disaster relief, which, like, as we've touched on, is, like, nothing that they are doing. Like, people are saying this is what they want at the same time that Canada is really ramping up its role as a warmonger, as a global arms dealer, as a weapons manufacturer, etc. So, like, when people say they want it, what in fact is actually happening are, like, on polar opposite sides of a spectrum. I think that people have been really sold a story of NATO specifically that is taking a long time to erode. that this is this somehow alliance of Western countries that is gonna save us from whoever is the country that we are being told usually a racist story about as a danger to us right now, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whatever. Like, and people have this idea that, yeah, basically that NATO is the only thing that is ever gonna save Canada from the imaginary threat. I mean, and there are real threats. Like, I'm not denying that, like, all of the military superpowers in the world are a threat to, frankly, everyone's life in a context where nuclear weapons are as widespread as they are. But people are struggling to understand that NATO has been a source of conflict and death far more than it has ever been sort of a dissuasive actor that protects Canada or that promotes peace in any way. And I mean, it's going to be celebrating its 75th anniversary this July. Actually, we're going to be doing a huge summit and rally and march on Washington from July 6th to 7th. If any folks want to bust down and join it, because, yeah, that is when NATO is going to be celebrating their 75th year birthday. So that will be a key point to really call out their true legacy of violence, of global instability. But I mean, yeah, I don't know what the easy answer is to help people understand that the current, I mean, even just the NATO specifically, like we've said, that it is like just this hugely destabilizing, law-breaking, war-provoking institution, but also more broadly that Canada sending weapons somewhere, sending soldiers somewhere, opening bases, as it is currently doing in other parts of the world, is doing presumably the opposite of what people think it's doing when they support it. But where I am getting hope is to come back to something we were talking about earlier. I mean, so we're talking about, on one hand, like the most powerful institutions on the planet when we're talking about militaries, when we're talking about the weapons companies and like the whole military industrial complex. But at these moments where people like across so-called Canada are discovering, as we talked about earlier, like the many dozens across the country of companies who, for example, are arming Israel and who are using Canadian infrastructure and railways and military export regimes and whatever to do that, and then are showing up at those spots. It's just a really powerful moment of recognizing, like, oh, right, this isn't this sort of untouchable, global, I don't know, kind of secret force. Like, these are real places where real people work. They, like, use our highways. Like, we actually can have an impact on what is happening here in tangible ways. I mean, yeah, and, like, you could pick any city in Canada, and, like, within just a few kilometers of the downtown core, or a few dozen kilometers, there are going to be companies who are, like, playing a key role in creating the weapons that are currently killing people in Gaza, which is horrific and terrible, but also is like a space of power and where we can actually do something.
You guys have an interactive map? We can all find one near us.
We do, yeah. If you go to...
Oh my God, I'm going to link it to the show notes.
No, we do. It's at worldbeyondwar.org/Canada Stop Arming Israel, and we've mapped out all the locations that we've been able to find thus far of companies. Some are factories, some are offices, but still important places where decisions are made.
None of them are off limits.
None of them are off limits, and many of them have been like protested, picketed, blockaded, interrupted in various ways, had office occupations and sit-ins over the past several months.
I feel like the concept of being anti-war is a spot of cognitive dissonance for many Canadians, where I think a lot of people believe that they are anti-war. A lot of people, when they think about like who they are as individuals, like, yeah, I don't like wars. But then there's all of these different ways that it's twisted and justified, and people find themselves supporting things, and there's always a reason to. There's always some way that you can justify it, but it's a difficult thing, I guess, to address for a lot of people, right? Nationalism in Canada still runs really deep, and until you address like that underlying nationalism, there'll always be a way to support war.
I think we are not anti-war as a country. We do a lot of celebrating war, but we just like guise it in the pretext that it leads to peace, right? Like that's a common mantra, the whole just spread democracy. Democracy means peace and stability, and it's a whole economic project, right? When Rachel says the causes of all this, like, I don't know, I just want to scream into the microphone, capitalism, right? Like, that's always...
It's funny though, like even like stuff like, I think of like Remembrance Day, right? And I feel like Remembrance Day in some ways it's kind of justified as a anti-war day in ways. It's not.
It doesn't feel like
it's very clearly not.
People look at you ugly when you wear the white poppy, they don't, or no poppy, I don't know what's best.
But like
to
as a
go.
kid, like in elementary school assemblies and stuff, like there were this idea that, this is like, we're remembering why wars are bad, and that's not what it is. Then they'll bring in people who are currently fighting in Iraq and stuff to talk to kids and stuff. Like I feel like just the manipulation of that sentiment is so powerful in Canada.
I do think that, Remembrance Day has like a more radical root, as like many holidays do. But yeah, I agree, has kind of become sort of a celebration of militarism. I mean, my kid who, she's 7 now, but a couple years ago came back, it was just last year, came back from school with Remembrance Day with like some like fancy, colorful handout booklet that I guess everyone had been given from the Canadian Armed Forces that had all these like cute cartoons of like animals that have been used in war like throughout history, and like look what the passenger pigeons did, and look what the role these dogs did, and like clearly 0% about like highlighting the horror of war and why it needs to end, and like all about like, what
my
would
kid's
be
not
exciting.
going then. No, he's just not going. Neither of them are going on that day. Forget it. I have enough work undoing that stuff.
Yeah, I have to send her in with some other anti-war materials this year. Clearly.
Counter handouts for the kids.
Yeah, and like they did do some white peace poppies. Like, I think there are places of intervention where if some parents raise it, it can sometimes happen. But to get back to your point, Santiago, about like kind of, like I was thinking about what you were saying about, like how it's just so pervasive, the culture of war. And I think one place where I've seen it sort of chip away is around folks understanding like of colonization. Like here, I think that, the foundational war of this country is obviously a war of colonization. That's part of the anti-war movement. It needs to be part of it to address that. And frankly, seeing specifically like the militarized violence playing out on Wet'suwet'en territory, for example, like I think helped people understand like, oh right, this is not just like colonial warfare in terms of horrific genocide here across Turtle Island and like people being brought to residential schools and blah, 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 and like how Orange Shirt Day became this huge thing everyone was talking about. Like I think the conversation has moved forward, hopefully, for a lot of people across the country in terms of understanding like, right, actually like the continued violent militarized seizure of Indigenous lands like is actually happening right now. And like this is an aspect of militarism that like we're seeing very locally, I guess, is what I'm saying. And similarly in terms of like the rise of militarized policing across Canada, like many of whose police forces like literally get weaponry and training, in some cases donated from the military. Like there's very direct connections. Like I think that can be an entry point for people understanding these institutions in different ways, or sort of seeing like, oh wait, like there's a dissonance between what I think is happening in Canada and what's actually happening. And not only are we not doing peacekeeping overseas like at all, there also is increased militarism like here as well.
Yeah, I think like what's happening and the movement around it and the work you're doing helps in this moment, is going to help Canadians draw those comparisons, because we talk about it over and over. Canada's colonial imagination, right? It's something that we're going to have to reconcile with. Like a lot of people don't realize how we harbor really colonial views, even though we would still outwardly say colonialism is bad, right? We know it was a bad thing. We know it led to genocide and displacement and all of the horrific things, but we still behave in very colonial ways, right? We've talked urban planning, all kinds of ways, like where we just kind of go along with it and nod because it's a real like settler approach to life. And as we're trying to understand why our peace-loving Canadian government, right? You hear the sarcasm, right? And is so complicit in this, right? It's just like there's a lot of Canadians who are struggling with this, right? Because it's so laid bare. There's really no hiding it, thanks to the work that's been done. And so this could be a moment, right, through horror, that we come to terms with what our role really is. And if we truly do, love those peacekeeper narratives and call ourselves anti-war, then, we have to take a completely different approach then to like all things, not just like the arms embargo, but what you talk about, that culture of peace and how we celebrate most of our holidays. It's not just Remembrance Day. It's embedded. It's like those flyovers at the soccer game. It's the fireworks for every friggin' holiday, and the imagery we use. And, it's endless, the work to be done there. But if there's a moment where folks really are forced to face it, it's got to be now, right?
The Toronto chapter is just launching a campaign right now to get the Toronto Air Show canceled, because it's just one instance of, so this is like, for those unfamiliar, just like a kind of what you'd picture, like a big air show that happens over the waterfront of Toronto every year, where some of the planes are like kind of old school, vintagey, like they look like more like they're just doing little flips or whatever. But then there's like Lockheed's F-35s that fly over the city, like deafening, like truly you cannot believe how loud these jets are. And they fly over the city for the entire Labor Day weekend. Deeply traumatizing to people who have left war zones to arrive in the city, but also everybody hates them, because like as a parent to two young kids, like my kids just can't nap for the entire weekend. Like it's awful. So they are broadly hated. So I think it's an entry point.
If listeners go back to whatever episodes were being recorded around that time.
We did one on the air show. Wow,
yeah.
The air show was pissing you off. Like we had to keep pausing the recording.
I live in Parkdale, so right over the path, and it's infuriating. And like Parkdale historically is a neighborhood that is a landing point for many migrants into the city, and it's horrible. And it's not just the air show. Like I remember I got really angry about when I went to the X, they had like a little military corner beside the food. I was looking for like somewhere to eat my food, because they have like all the great food there, and they had like all of these guns and military vehicles and stuff, and they had the kids posing with the guns. They say, here, jump into the middle of like this vehicle and pretend you're shooting the gun, and here, pretend you're shooting this turret. And I had to call Jessa because I was furious at like the level of like propaganda that was happening there. Like the fact that I'm just trying to find a place where to eat my food, and like it was really messed up. And also, side note, one thing I just thought about while I'm sitting here, because I looked over to my right and I have my fan, and it has Honeywell on it. And then I remembered that Honeywell is a
shame,
very large
you broke the
arms
boycott.
manufacturer. No, hey, this was a free fan given to me like 7 years ago. I did not. But my point being is that like it's also sometimes hard to comprehend like how many companies that like are doing things that like creating like consumer goods that are like things that we might have sitting on our desk beside us, are so involved in military industrial complex and like the expanse of it. Like, it's so hard to get away from, I guess.
For sure. And I mean, I mean, the best part of my job, to be honest, is like getting to work with like groups of people like all across the country who are just doing like really rad stuff. But like, there's a great group of folks out in Newfoundland, so shout out to them. And they have just been like constantly picketing and showing up and disrupting their local weapons manufacturer, Kraken Robotics, like out in Mount Pearl. Like, this is a small town in Newfoundland. And the company is like kind of panicking and like is clearly telling employees talking points because they're sort of responding to these activists online, in person at the pickets in various ways. And one thing they're constantly trying to say is like, oh, well, we're not a weapons company. Like, we do all this other stuff. Like, this is a way that they try to defend what they're doing. And frankly, even Lockheed Martin, like the largest weapons company on the planet, makes some consumer product. Like, there is not a single weapons company that isn't also going to make something that is innocuous and that there's nothing wrong with it, that's just like in an office building or whatever. But it's beside the point when Kraken Robotics is making systems directly for Elbit, Israel's biggest weapons company. But they're panicking and they're trying to sort of figure out how they can justify what they're doing. And no doubt many of the employees there are having a personal crisis. And I mean, to be fair, until these protests started, many of them likely genuinely did not know about what some of the work that they were doing, like what was happening with it when it went overseas, because it's often to the company's advantage not to share that. So frankly, the workers at these companies, I would say, are never the enemies. Management is a whole other story. But like, I always see these workers as like potential allies in our struggle.
Job creator. Say it.
Yeah, for sure. No, and I mean, like, they might not have other choices, and B, sometimes they can then be like informants, or they can give us information. Like, we do have like a whistleblower call out on our website where we've set up like various safe structures by which people can like anonymously and safely, I mean, nothing's ever 100% safe. If you've got like Julian Assange level information, like, this might not be the place for it. But we've tried to set up safe channels as possible so people can like kind of anonymously leak us information, because there's a lot happening behind closed doors that we don't know about, and frankly, most workers at these companies don't know about either.
I immediately think of Boeing and like killing 2 whistleblowers, and we like
Allegedly.
there needs to be so allegedly killing 2 whistleblowers, and it's like, and I remember they put out the apology, and it's like, oh no, this large weapons manufacturer would never ever assassinate anyone. That unheard of.
None of our products are associated with death in any way. But all that to say, like, your Honeywell fan is probably not the issue. I mean, for sure, don't go out and intentionally give money to these companies at this point.
You'd probably just end up with an LG fan, and we'd still have to shame you. There you go.
I'm gonna take my hand fan that I bought at the X
and use that instead. And I
more
mean,
work, but
none of us, like, really, it's hard to find a single person who's not using like Google in any way or Amazon in any way. Like, these are like almost inextricable from like using computers at this point, and they are like major players in supplying the Israeli military with its like cloud technology, with its blah blah blah. Like, yeah, and our call has not actually been to boycott all these companies. Like, we follow leadership obviously of like the BNC and like international Palestinian-led boycott campaigns, but like, there's a reason that they don't just like list every company under the sun and say boycott all of it. Like, it's not usually effective.
Because it becomes overwhelming, too, as the participant of a boycott, to try to keep track of all of these different ones, to target and show your power, right? And show how people feel, right? Like, what the environment is that they have to operate in, or it should be hostile, right? Like, that if you're going to do this, this could be the response. You could be next, right? So you make an example out of the key players, hopefully. And because we've seen, like, boycotts work. And the blockades, although sometimes temporary, have different values as well, right? Like, they may not have completely stopped it, but there's stuff that it does to the participants, to those who witness it from beyond, and then, you know, sends a message to the folks that you're really trying to talk to. So Let's bring it back, though, to Gaza and the call for an arms embargo. For folks listening, I mean, we've talked a lot about what they could do in these moments. That's really all we talk about on the show is like different things that you can do, but very specific to World Beyond War. If people wanted to get involved or help you on your very kind of specific mission, what can they do?
So right now we're trying to get MPs to sign on to this demand, and I know that like that's not always like the most exciting project for everyone, but it's important because like this is like a concrete demand. Like it's important to call for like a ceasefire now and an end to the siege, and like many demands are very important. But an arms embargo is one the Canadian government can actually do right now without relying on international actors, and that will have like a real material impact on the Israeli war machine. As more and more MPs sign on and say they demand it, like it will become an impossible demand for the Canadian government to ignore. Like like I think this is winnable, is what I'm saying, and I think it's important. So yeah, I mean, I would encourage folks to go to armsembargonow.ca. There's various ways to join in there, but like see if your MP has endorsed the demand, and if not, you know what to get them to do. This is a really important thing to hassle them about it. And frankly, I think that the parts of why we have moved the Canadian government in small but still significant ways over the past few months is that many MPs have not been able to like go out for a meal in public without someone coming to talk to them about why are you continuing to be complicit in the genocide in Gaza. And like I think those are tactics that are really powerful, and we have to keep them up. But it's important to have a specific demand to your MPs so they know what they have to do to get people to stop bugging them at their favorite local restaurant. I mean, yeah, and then beyond that, like as mentioned, we put out a map of weapons manufacturers across the country. Like those are great places to start looking into. Like, yeah, who is making these weapons and exporting them near you, and what can be done about it. And that can look different in different places. But there's a lot of great examples of what has already happened. And then there have been moments of like really powerful escalations across the country where I think it was in 1 week, like 8 different weapons manufacturers got shut down for a day, and it was very powerful that it was all happening at the same time. Or in mid-April, there were sort of global actions on April 15th that I think you talked about on your show as well, that kind of rolled out all across for the whole week across so-called Canada with like rail and port and highway blockades. Powerful moments where people who could take bigger risks did, and that has a big impact.
I just want to remind people, in case you've missed all those episodes, that we've talked about blockades, and Rachel mentioned the Kraken Industries in Mount Pearl. Sometimes, like, you're talking about like 6 or 7 people stretched across a strategic lane or road or picket, not even a hard picket line, right? Just a soft picket where you're talking to workers as they're going in, you're delaying them maybe just for the morning shift because that's all you folks had availability for, right? You don't look at any of these locations or targets as insurmountable because, you know, you're not part of World Beyond War yet, or, you know, you may not have an army of people to like permanently blockade these industries. That's really not the idea always, right? So it's nice to know, although horrific to think how many there are, but that also makes them accessible to folks to step up. I imagine a lot of your work is facilitating them to a degree. Like you're one person, one paid staff, right? So it's like you can only do so much. So rather than like replicate the work, do you sometimes assist folks who have already organized themselves? What can you do for them? Like, do you network with them?
Yeah, I do a lot of connecting. So like, oh, you folks in this very rural, small place are interested in doing this thing. Let me connect you with these folks on maybe the other side of the country who in similar circumstances did something, so like you can learn from each other. Like I try to be sort of a grassroots connector in that way, and then to sort of provide resources. So some like incredible people have been working with me, like with no pay, like grassroots organized volunteer workers, have been to put together, for example, all the research that does list those like 50 plus different weapons companies and the hundreds of locations across the country. That felt like a key resource that made sense for World Beyond War to put out, so that then people could run with it in the different ways that they are doing so. But we've also put out, for example, with allies, like a toolkit on how to take on your local weapons factory that's like sort of step by step what you can do. How do you scout these locations? How do you figure out what's happening there? Like those kinds of resources that then, what people do with them is up to them.
We just make the components. We don't put them together.
So what you're saying is you've released what one might say are blueprints of disruption?
Oh, yes. I'll steal that from you.
She's competing with us. We'll just link it in the show notes. Take credit.
But frankly, this is a moment where people are desperate to act and to do what they can, which is like really beautiful. And I mean, the first thing I should have said when you were sort of asking about what people can do is like the powerful things, like start where people are. So like that can be starting with like your local weapons factory, but it can also be starting, like, for example, we've been working with a really cool group of Ontario teachers who have been looking into the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan and like what are their ways that their like salaries.
I think I might know what teachers those are.
Yeah, and like what are the ways that their salaries as teachers are like directly funding these same weapons companies that are like destroying Gaza and profiting off of it enormously right now. And they've been awesome, and they crashed the pension plan meeting and like completely took it over and derailed it. Like it did not happen the way they wanted to go. They're not slowing down. And I mean, and it's partially about divesting their pension plan, but it's partially them like mobilizing as teachers within their institutions. To say not only are we like accountable to our students directly and like to the education and to like us being able to talk about the harm that's happening in the world, but like, all the ways the teachers are complicit we need to address. And I mean, many of them I've also been seeing at the encampment, for example, at U of T, and it's like they're high school students from a couple years ago who are now like leading the encampment as undergrads at U of T. So like the impact of motivated, organized high school teachers like cannot be underestimated.
It is nice to see people kind of taking models and using them where they are, because the desperation to do something thankfully has not weaned in all of this time. I think it's grown. And people are realizing their power, to disrupt and play a role. And I think making that argument that Canada is a key player in this, because that is what a lot of people use to dissuade protests. What do you think you're going to do with that here? And why don't you go over there and do it? And it's like, you got to do what you got to do where you are with what you have, right? Because we've talked to local Palestinian solidarity groups that organize riding by riding and finding avenues there. And I think people will be surprised. Like, you don't even need a Palestinian solidarity group. Like, there's like optimist clubs and church groups that are organizing against this genocide in different ways. So there's somebody out there in your community that you could literally just team up with. I imagine at this point, they would not be too hard to find.
And when I was saying like bug your MP at the local restaurant when you see them there about an arms embargo, I mean, it could be that, or it could be like, maybe you have a church group and maybe you're telling them like, actually, like, you're not welcome to come give speeches come election time at our church or at our church picnic or at our whatever, if you're not going to make this demand. Like, there are ways to sort of, even at the level of MP pressure, be in the communities that you have and recognize the leverage that you have as a group there.
Absolutely. I very much appreciate seeing like World Beyond War every time I'm loading up Instagram and finding these actions. I know you folks in some way contribute to the Toronto Community Justice Fund. So I imagine you have a team around you, but when you said you were the only staff member here, I found that hard to believe. I trust you, but it was just like seeing World Beyond War getting quoted in the media, getting airplay, organizing incredible direct actions, like inspiring stuff. So I so appreciate the amount of work you must be doing, Rachel. I don't think I can imagine how busy you are. So then I also very much appreciate taking time to come on the show and working out the nuts and bolts with us on what you do and why you do it.
Thank you so much. And I mean, I will say that, like, so yes, I'm the only staff person. I'm the only person paid to do World Beyond War work in Canada. But like our vision is always of like a grassroots radical anti-war movement. And I mean, some might say that there should be no staff at all in that case, and that's totally fair. I personally feel enormously privileged. I get to do this work as my day job, but like the goal is always to support and empower and walk alongside folks across the country who, yeah, this is not going to be their job. This is what they are doing for justice and against violence and all of that. And like, so what does it mean to, yeah, to support grassroots organizing across the country, and not in a way where, you know, we're an NGO that repeats other types of harmful models. Like, what are the ways that we can use the little resources we have to like support people in like actually doing the meaningful and the radical work? And it's like a tough, and it's a work in progress, but like this is, like I said, such a powerful moment where everyone is just like giving everything they've got right now. And yeah, like as far as responses go to like just the horrors we're seeing live streamed on our phones every night. I don't know if you, like me, have the unhealthy habit of just like watching live streams from Gaza in bed at night. I should stop doing that. But like, thank goodness that one thing that I'm seeing coming out of the people who are also doing that is like that then they get up the next morning and just like recommit to doing whatever they can 8 months in. Like I almost can't believe it.
We've talked about that, how it's just everything you do in sacrifice just pales sometimes in comparison. And if that's all that keeps you going and keeps you motivated, is the fact that other people are likely doing more in more terrible circumstances. But yes, I doom scroll. No fault there, Rachel, but I feel how hard your work must be. So whatever motivates you, I suppose, right? Yeah, again, thank you so much for the work that you and your comrades do. We very much appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you.
And same to you.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.